Good evening and welcome to Unravelling, where we are confronting a culture that is pulling us apart. In part one of Unravelling, we spent our time looking at the worldview of our culture. And then last time we started the second part of Unravelling, where we were looking at a Christian worldview. So this time, Tim, we want to spend our time both comparing and contrasting those worldviews. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Now we've had some time to examine both of them. What we want to do tonight is to compare them.
Okay.
In summary, see where the key differences lie. And really spend our time exploring what's it like to live in that worldview. Given that worldview, what are the logical consequences? Where does it take us? What's the experience of that like when we really get into it? So we're going to have some discussion around that, which will hopefully help us to get a better grasp of how those two worldviews actually make a difference in practice for our lives.
And that's going to be really important when we move on to the second part. Well, which part are we on? The third part of Unravelling, that's it. So it's going to be really important before we move on to really tackling some bigger issues or...
Yeah, we're hoping that by the end of this part, we, as best we can, will be prepared to start looking at specific issues in our culture.
Yeah.
But with a greater awareness of how we're coming to them and what assumptions we're making in the background that will affect the way we see them. So hopefully by the end of tonight, we'll be able to lay out a bit of a plan for part three to sort of set us up for that.
Brilliant. So how are we going to go about comparing and contrasting these worldviews?
Yeah.
I've heard that you're not going to be using the flow chart tonight. Is that right?
I think it's time to let go of the flow charts, at least for one video. But I have still got a couple of slides that we'll refer to. But a good place to start is just the comparison on some of these fundamental differences between the worldview of our culture and the Christian worldview. So if we walk through those, and then take things from there. So on the left here, we have our Christian worldview, and on the right, our modern, postmodern worldview, the kind of worldview of our culture that we explored in the part one of Unravelling. And these are the three key contrasts that I want to pull out. There's more you could pull out, but these are the three that I want us to focus on at the start of tonight. So for our cultural worldview, the postmodern worldview, modern worldview, this is naturalism. If you remember, we talked about how in our cultural stories, we assume that there's nothing beyond nature.
Yeah.
And that's what leads into everything that followed. And the sort of posh word for that is naturalism.
Okay.
That assumption that we haven't got anything other than nature.
Yeah.
The Christian worldview is fundamentally different because it's theism. We assume that there's a God, a transcendent being that created nature. So there isn't just nature, there's something beyond nature. As we go on tonight, we'll see how these matter, but that's a key point of contrast.
Okay. The
second one then is relativism versus what I've called one true truth. And this is because I couldn't find a good single word to sum up the sort of opposite of relativism.
Okay.
You could say absolutism, but that could sound like all sorts of things.
Yep.
So for our cultural worldview, it's relativism. There are many truths. If we make truth as individuals, as society, like we talked about, then there's lots of different truths out there, and no one of those can trump the others. That's relativism. All truths are relative to all other truths, and that's
right.
Whereas with the Christian worldview, because we believe in God, because we are theists, there is therefore one true truth about reality, because it's defined by God. And so finally then, the third contrast is that for our modern, postmodern worldview, our main task as human beings, when it comes to truth, is truth making, creating truth. Again, we've talked about that a lot. But the contrast with the Christian worldview is that for Christians, our main task is truth finding, not truth making.
Right.
And so as we go on tonight, I hope to tease out why those differences make a difference in our lived experience. But hopefully that's clear, three clear points of difference that I'm suggesting are really important.
Okay, so which are we going to be looking at first?
So we're going to start with our cultural worldview, the modern, postmodern worldview. And perhaps a helpful place to start is to ask the question of what are we looking for in this worldview? That if we're in the story of power and oppression, if we're in the story of identity, if we're living through those lenses, what are we looking for? What do we want? What are we trying to attain?
Yeah. And I suppose that's because we're all looking for like a good life or sort of happiness, security. Everyone's looking for something, aren't they?
We tend to be driven by purpose. Some sense of purpose, isn't we say? So I think that might be a good question to get us into that. And so there's two particular things that I think we're looking for as humans, really, that's played out in this worldview.
Mm-hmm.
And the first is a meaningful life. It's a big old world out there, isn't it? And however many billion people now exist, and none of us want to feel like we are irrelevant, we don't matter, life counts for nothing. We want to feel that we matter. Because if we don't matter, then our actions every day don't matter. Life quickly becomes meaningless. It's very hard to live like that. So I think one of the things we're really looking for is a meaningful life. And you see that in the identity story that we need to make ourselves.
Yes.
And what are we looking for in the way we're making ourselves? We're looking to be somebody, aren't we? To not necessarily be somebody as like a big celebrity. We don't all want that, although many of us do.
I suppose we want to matter, though, or feel like our life matters.
We want to have something to offer. To count. And so when we're making ourselves, that's often, whether we admit it or not, what's going on under the surface is what sort of me would give me a meaningful life and a sense of value to those around me. And we see that in our language of self-esteem. We have to think well of ourselves according to the self-esteem narrative. We matter, we're an individual. So we've got that going on, I think. And I think this is closely tied as well to a meaningful life in the sense that we're looking for love as well and connection with other people, aren't we? Again, none of us really want to be alone, isolated, detached, disconnected from everyone around us. We want to be loved and we want to love others. And that's why I think, again, in the identity story, when we make ourselves, we talked about how in our culture, it's not just that I make myself, but then that has to be expressed. And received and
shared in the world. And...
it matters that you acknowledge who I think I am and who I've told you I am. And I think really that's looking for a sense of knowing and being known, that if I'm saying this is who I am and you're recognising that, you're coming to know me. And then through that, I'm able to experience love. At least that's, I think, what we're kind of aiming for under the surface. So a meaningful life, I think, is the first thing that we're looking for in these worldviews.
And I suppose this is like, with the identity story, it's so closely linked to having that sense of I matter and therefore I can be loved.
And the way that needing to be loved ties in with our sense of value is complex in all sorts of ways, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So I think a meaningful life is the first thing that we're looking for. And the other thing that we're looking for, I would say, is a cause to live for. Again, that sense of purpose. None of us, in the end, is big enough to fulfill a sense of purpose. We all need something beyond ourselves to live for. And I think particularly the story of power and oppression, it channels that kind of desire. That through that story of power and oppression, we're trying to find something to live for, I think. So think, for example, of some of the language that comes with that story of power and oppression, the search for justice, freedom, equality, dealing with oppression. These are big moral terms, aren't they? And they give us a sense of purpose when we're involved with that.
I think it almost, like you say, using those words, it makes us bigger than ourselves. It's something beyond us as well, isn't it? That sense of, if you're fighting for freedom, that's something that's beyond me. It's like, I want my life to matter for this.
For something that's not just about me. I think you're absolutely right. And So one metaphor for this, which I think is really true, is we all need to live in a story. We've talked about stories through the whole of Unravelling, haven't we? And we need that in our heads, a story of how the world is, of which I can play a part, that is purposeful. And the story of Power and Oppression gives us a story to slot ourselves into. But more than just a story, it's also a fight. Isn't it?
It's a cause.
It's a cause, but it's a fight. There's not just a story to be a part of, but a battle to win. Which draws on something deep in us, again, that we want to, I think we all fundamentally want to fight on the side of good and against evil. The vast majority of us, I think, want that. And want to understand our lives to some extent in that framework, that we're giving something for the good.
Absolutely.
Because again, then things matter.
And things matter.
I've got something to live for.
So all of those things that you've mentioned then, aren't they all good things?
Yeah. And from a Christian worldview, I think we can explain why we have these desires, why these are good things to look for, and how we can actually do it. And the real tragedy, as I see it, of our culture is that this modern, postmodern worldview can't in the end deliver those things. Even though they're what we want, and to a large extent they drive us into these stories of identity and power and oppression, they can't actually deliver the very things that they seem to offer and they seem to promise, which is really sad when you think about it, because we are drawn into something that consumes some of our best motives and desires, but never gets us where we want to go.
And why is that?
And that's what we're going to spend the next sort of significant chunk of this evening on. We can't be comprehensive. You could write books answering that question. People do write books.
There's lots of books out there.
Question. But I have identified 6 points that I think would be helpful for us to go through that will at least indicate some of the reasons why modernism and postmodernism can't deliver what they seem to promise. So in lieu of a flowchart, we have a little 6-pronged diagram here. So we'll tackle one point at a time. And where I want to start is you remember the contrast that we started with, where we said our cultural worldview is relativism? That all truths are equally valid. And the problem with relativism, and therefore the problem for living in this worldview and any of the stories that it tells, is that relativism leads us into a meaning crisis, really. And this is because if every truth has an equal seat at the table, we have no way of adjudicating between truths. We make truth, we don't find it. So my creation of truth, why should that be any better than your creation of truth or someone else's creation of truth? And therefore we can't arbitrate between them. I might think we should go left. You might think we should go right. Someone else thinks we should go straight ahead.
So there's no sort of like hierarchy of truth. We can't work that out.
There's no reality beyond us. That we can bring our versions of the truth to and say, which of these versions of the truth is closer to reality? Relativism denies us that. But then truth, any language of truth, becomes meaningless, really. What does it mean to know the truth or to have a true opinion? We just have opinion, don't we? Your view, my view.
Because I think otherwise we have like which truth is more true.
Which opinion is more valid? Well, that relies on some idea of there being a truth beyond our opinions. And sometimes what happens then is we just go to majority vote. The truth is what most of us think. If there's not a reality out there that we have access to, then we go with majority vote. But if we do that, that means that what we think is true is always unstable. Because there could come along a change in the majority view where we all now think something different. Or we who were in the majority somehow now find ourselves in the minority. And so we can never really be confident in any truth when it's just majority vote. And it's important to remember, I think, when we talk about the meaning crisis, that we're not just talking about meaning of scientific facts or observations of our world, but we're talking about moral values as well. So what we think justice is, what is the fair thing to happen
Yeah.
in this situation? Well, that's equally controlled by relativism. So what I think is fair and what you think is fair and what someone else thinks is fair, there's no way to choose between whose version of fairness is more correct.
Yeah.
So in moral
We get
relativism
lost.
as well, and this has been described philosophically as a emotivism, really, where moral statements now just become expressions of how I feel.
Okay.
So I might say, oh, it's wrong to beat up an old granny and take her purse.
Yeah.
But all I'm really expressing, because there's no truth that can verify that, all I'm really saying is I don't like it.
Yeah, because I suppose there's nothing beyond you that's saying that.
Yeah.
That can be your opinion, and it might differ with somebody else's opinion.
Someone else comes up and says, well, actually, I quite enjoy beating up grannies and taking their purse.
Yeah.
There's no court of appeal beyond, well, I don't like that, and I now think you're a bad person.
Yeah.
But there's nothing more solid than that. And this gives us massive problems. We now don't know truth.
Yeah.
We don't have stable ground for our moral views. And that's and so even though the story of Power and Oppression, for example, expresses very strong moral opinions about what's right and wrong and what we should do and what we shouldn't do. And we're drawn to that because we want a cause to live for.
Yeah.
But the tragedy is we find we never delivered that because of the meaning crisis.
Right.
Because when we really drill down into, what is the right thing here?
Yeah.
We have no answer for that.
Okay.
And so that's our first big problem with our cultural worldview, really. The second problem with our cultural worldview is one that was identified by C.S. Lewis when he was writing 70-odd years ago, but is really critical to understand, but perhaps is the hardest of our 6 points. We'll take a little bit of time and feel free to come back at me if it doesn't make sense. But starting from the position of naturalism, remember that means there's nothing outside of nature.
Yeah.
And if there's nothing outside of nature, then everything that happens, any event that occurs, must be fully explicable just by what we have in nature. So the processes of the raw materials of nature interacting, happening over time, that is what produces the events that we have. And there's no other possible explanation for why anything happens, because there's nothing outside of nature.
So everything in nature has got to be explained by itself.
That is exactly what I mean.
Okay.
You can't appeal to something outside of nature to explain what's going on in nature. Okay, that's that's the first place we need to get to. If this is true, then this also applies to our thoughts, our beliefs, our truth claims, because of course we can't start appealing to something outside nature to explain why I think what
we're part of nature, so
we're all locked in to this one system. And therefore, even the things going on in my mind, my ideas, my beliefs are have to only be explained by nature. And therefore, these are events that ultimately have been determined by the ongoing process of nature unfolding. There's no other way they could be because there's no other input other than the unfolding of nature. So we may not be able to work out that determinism, but logically it must be the case that I only think what I think because of all that has unfolded up to now. Does that make sense?
Think so. So whatever point we're at now is because of what's happened in nature leading up to this point.
It has to have only come about because of what's happened. And that includes our mental events. Including our beliefs. Including what we think of as our use of reason. And the massive issue with this is it means that all of the things that we believe, all of our truth claims are only inevitable events going on in our consciousness. And therefore, they're not something that we could have chosen otherwise. They're not, we haven't made a kind of free, mental, reasonable decision on these things. So we have no reason to trust or to believe that anything that we think has any actual relation to reality.
Right.
Because you couldn't think anything else.
So,
You're just living in the outcome of the unfolding process of nature.
okay, so am I right in thinking then that, so if I think something, but then I also means that later on down the line, I may then think something else, and then that, therefore what I thought before is now invalid.
Well, those events of you thinking something and thinking something different were just always going to happen.
Right, okay.
So none of the things that you think has any necessary relation to what's actually real. Okay. You can't do other than think what you think. And we have no reason to put any weight on that being true to any kind of reality, because you're locked into the system. And what C.S. Lewis pointed out is he said the issue with this then is that naturalism, the belief that there is only nature and nothing beyond it, is itself just a determined mental event that we have no reason to consider leads us to any truth. So reason itself is undermined by naturalism.
Because reason is something that we as a society has thought up. So it's come from us anyway.
They're inevitable events. So reason, we normally think of reason as the ability to distinguish and to have coherent logical arguments, but none of this is true if naturalism's true. What we think we experience as reason is just inevitable mental events produced by the one interlocking system of nature. And if that's true, then we have no reason to think that naturalism is true. So it's a bit like, do you remember how we talked about with the postmodern worldview that if there is no absolute truth, then you saw off the branch you sit on, because to say there's no absolute truth is an absolute truth claim. C.S. Lewis says that naturalism is exactly the same thing, that when we assume naturalism's true, we lose any grounds for actually holding naturalism to be true.
The bottom's fallen out.
The bottom has fallen out. The snake eats itself. And so ultimately, philosophically, this is the massive problem that naturalism can never escape from on its own terms.
So for some of us, Tim, that will be a bit of a stretch for us to get our head around some of that. But I feel like for other people that have maybe read up on some of this stuff before.
There's probably some people going to watch this video who have read a lot about naturalism, and they'll be aware of where, oh, Tim, you've skipped over this bit, and actually that argument can be put a different way. I'm aware of that, but we didn't want to spend 20 minutes on this. So I think what I'd say really is, obviously, you could engage C.S. Lewis's in his book Miracles. He made this argument at much greater length, and there have been many commentators since then. But also we can pick this up in the Q&A at the end if people want to dig deeper into that. I'm happy to do it. But also don't want to thoroughly bore those who aren't interested in this point at all.
Happy with where we've got to.
So there you go. Maybe we've got the worst of both worlds.
Great. So
hopefully we've got the best.
What's our next point then?
So our next point is quite different. So the next point is about the identity story. And really, this is to say that we talked at the start about how we want a meaningful life. And out of the identity story, part of what I think we're looking for is the experience of love. But tragically, the identity story actually stops us from experiencing real love. And the reason is that in the identity story, we are told that we have to make ourselves. And it's that self that I make that I then present to you. And I really want you to love the self that I make, whether I admit it or not, I do. But if that's not the real me, if this is a false self, which we could talk more about, then even if you love that, I won't actually feel loved because it's not really me. So a little catchphrase for this is that only our real selves can experience real love. So if I'm presenting you a self that I've made that isn't really a reflection of who I am at my most true identity, then no matter how much you love that, I will never feel it. And so I can get trapped in this cycle where I'm desperately trying to make something you'll love. And the more successful I am, the more despair
the less you feel known.
because my best efforts still aren't translating into a deeply felt and experienced love.
Yeah.
Because you're loving something I've made
Okay.
that isn't really me. Does that?
That does make sense. But if you're assuming then that if what I make isn't truly who I am, we're looking at a different worldview then. Because from this point of view, from the cultural worldview, who I make myself to be is who I am.
Exactly. You're absolutely right. So this is a criticism that comes from a Christian worldview, or a worldview that does say, we have a self that isn't dependent on us making ourselves.
Yeah.
So you're right, really, and that's okay. There is no view from nowhere. So we can't get to some totally objective, neutral space to critique these worldviews.
Okay.
No one has the view from nowhere.
Yeah.
We all have a view from somewhere. My view is coming from a Christian worldview.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean that we can't evaluate what I've just said. And this argument, even though it's from a Christian worldview, we can still evaluate and say, well, does it actually match up with the reality that we experience? Is it kind of logically coherent, but does it match experience? And I would argue that this really does match the experience of us in our world at the moment. We could maybe go back to our culture of self-esteem.
Yes.
To dig into that a bit. So, I've noticed in many environments which have promoted a healthy self-esteem that they can't cope with the question of why.
Okay.
So I may be told, Tim, you're amazing and you need to think of yourself as a wonderful person and et cetera, but if I'm to say, but why? What is your basis for telling me
why am I good,
Liz?
Yeah.
On what is that just your opinion? Because if it's just your opinion, well, you could be wrong.
Yeah.
How do I know there is something of value that my self-esteem is actually built on?
Yeah.
And it's often not there.
Yeah.
And so really what we just have is a boosterism, that we keep boosting each other verbally, but there's not necessarily a solid ground for that. And therefore we're always pretty insecure that I'm going to need you to keep boosting me relentlessly.
Yeah.
Because it's vacuous, really. It's thin. And I guess I'd ask you, you think of ourselves, because we're not immune from any of this, but the friends we have, the contacts we make, doesn't that really thin grasp of personal value and constantly trying to make ourselves in a way that we'll be loved, but really insecure that isn't this ring quite true to life?
So I think even the fact that we have that culture of having self-esteem, or like you say, needing to boost ourselves, I think comes from the fact of we can feel good one day and be pleased with what we've presented to the world, but I think we all sort of have that feeling of, oh, but they don't know this about me, or they don't know that about me, or
if they really knew who I really was.
Yes. Or tomorrow I go and I do something that I go, oh, that means now I'm not a good person anymore.
Yeah.
So to hold on to that, and I think that's part of where we have this self-esteem culture, that constant need to, I am good. But like you say, but why?
Why? And if it's ultimately, like the identity story tells us, all that is grounded in what you can make of yourself. Yeah. The pressure's on, isn't it?
Very much so.
And we're jumping ahead now, but that's what leads to a lot of despair, I think, is that it really is down to you to secure the love that you need. Yeah. And it doesn't work.
Pretty bleak.
So that's our third criticism, really, of why our culture works. It's really sad because it promises so much, the identity story, but actually what it asks us to do steals from us the chance to experience, because I can only really be loved by you if you actually know who I am.
Yeah. Yeah.
Warts and all. So moving on to our next point. There it is. So we've talked about the identity story, moving to the power and oppression story now. One of the reasons why that doesn't deliver is that ultimately it doesn't give us a vision of the good for us to live for. We talked about we need a cause to live for.
Yes. Want to fight for something.
Our postmodern culture sells us that. Power and oppression story says, here you go. Here's a cause to live for.
Yeah.
Here's something to fight for. But when you think it through to its logical consequences, it actually doesn't have a vision of what is good and beautiful and worth fighting for. It can only tell you things to be against.
Okay.
So think back to the power and oppression story where everything's a power game. Truth is socially constructed. So the aim is to identify where the power lies that's being used to oppress others.
Okay.
And to problematize, to deconstruct. We take that power down.
Just get rid of the power.
And then what happens? We then, because there's only power games, because truth is only socially constructed, there'll be a new dominant paradigm.
Does the power game then just move to somebody else?
Which will need to be deconstructed and problematized, and then we'll have a new paradigm that emerged that no doubt someone will feel needs to be problematized. Like there's always, because we're all different, there's always a difference.
Someone's always got a problem with whatever's in power.
And there's always going to be a minority view.
Okay.
And so what we end up doing is in a system where we keep taking down, deconstruct. But if we turn around and ask, but what are we building?
Okay.
Then we have to talk about positive values. So if we want to build a just world, we need to have an idea of what justice means.
Yes.
Which would be a truth claim.
Okay.
But if that truth claim is only a social construct, it's inevitably going to be oppressive and will need deconstructing. So I'm never given something that I can work for.
Yeah.
I've only got things I can work against.
Right.
Or again, to maybe draw on C.S. Lewis, he said that this culture and really things haven't, what he saw when he was writing is where we are now, is all about seeing through things.
Okay.
You tell me that this, that and the other, but I see through this, that this is just a power grab on your part. He says if we see through everything, in the end, there's nothing to see.
Right.
And this is our problem, that if you want to offer actual vision of the good, what's beautiful, what's right, what should we work for, what am I going to sacrifice for?
Yeah.
If I've only got deconstruction, ultimately I run out of steam.
Yep.
I'm not building anything. I'm just tearing things down.
You're not saying that deconstruction is never important, though, are you?
No, not at all. Sometimes we need to clear the ground of something that's wrong, but that's only ever worth it if you're going to then build something that's worth having instead. And as I say, really, the story of power and oppression can't offer us that. And the moral values that it does promote and draw on, really, in the end, it's parasitic on Judeo-Christian values, really. So it talks about equality, freedom, justice, love, in standing up for the oppressed. But it can't give a positive account of these things on its own because of the relativism. So it has to really take them.
So you're saying it's piggybacking on what we think as Christians.
And this is an argument made at much greater length by Tom Holland in his book Dominion, for example, to a recent publication that's quite widely read. But what it does mean, if you're only ever trapped in deconstruction, that's quite emotionally wearing, isn't it? To keep taking something down, taking something down. The soul gets tired of that unless you got something to really live for.
Yeah.
So I think that's our fourth problem with our cultural worldview. So the fifth point that I want to pick up is this, that our own opinions and belief become absolute and pull us apart. So what I mean here is that within our cultural worldview, the modern, postmodern worldview, there's no transcendent dimension, there's no God, there's just nature.
Yeah.
We talked about that at the start. And what that means is that if that is true, then my beliefs, my opinions, the things that I think matter, again, are down on me to do something about and to deliver on. I can't rely on God to ultimately bring a good future about.
Right.
If I've got a view on what a good future is, if I'm in this great battle that needs to be fought, well, I need to win it.
You're the only one that can fight that.
I'm the only one that can fight the battle. And I think what this means is that we're almost inevitably then driven into violence and into conflict because it's a relativist worldview. So there's no way of arbitrating between your view of the future and my view
Yeah.
of the future. We can't judge them as which is more true. So but they're very important to us.
Yes, we hold them very strongly.
Hold them very strongly. There's no one else to ensure that future.
Okay.
So we're almost inevitably going to fight
Right.
to deliver what we think
Yeah.
is the best future. And so I think conflict and violence is built in
Right.
to our cultural worldview. Again, we talk about, we want peace and freedom and justice, but in the midst of that, conflict is built in.
Yeah.
And whereas, if we have a transcendent element of our worldview where there is a God, there is something beyond nature, then he is ultimately responsible for all things.
Okay. Yeah.
So as important as my opinions are to me, I don't have to give everything or kind of, I don't have to do whatever it takes to get my way.
It's not only down to you to fight for it. And
Exactly. They're held elsewhere by God in a Christian worldview. He's the one that ensures hope in the future, not my actions, if that makes sense. So I'm not locked into violence in the same way.
But don't we still see a lot of sort of violence or fighting and disagreement among Christians as well?
Yeah, I think probably as I say that, that's what most people watching the video are thinking. They're thinking, well, who knows what they're thinking, but there's a lot of violence that has been done under the name of all kinds of religions, is still being done, as well as, and not just by kind of religions, but by people as well who hold. And so I think what I'm suggesting here is not that if you've got a transcendent element of your worldview, you won't be violent.
You're all peaceful.
No, that's not true. Humans do all kinds of things. But what I'm saying is the logical entailment of a worldview. With a theistic worldview, there's actually very good reasons within your worldview why you can pursue peace and why you don't have to pursue your own beliefs with kind of unjust means or with violence, with conflict. Whereas in our cultural worldview, it is the logical entailment of that worldview because there's no one else who can win that battle. So maybe we can pick that up more in the Q&A of kind of, well, why are Christians violent then and that sort of thing. But on the sort of, on a worldview level, what's necessary as a consequence of our worldview, I think that's a really important difference.
Okay.
So if you're happy with that short answer.
Yep, that's great.
One person who's written widely about this is Rowan Williams, actually former Archbishop of Canterbury. Done a lot of work on faith in the public square, and he articulates really well why those with a theistic worldview can actually be released to pursue social peace as a logical entailment of their view. So for those who want more, his book, A Public Hope, is a good place to go.
Great.
Should we finish off?
Absolutely. What's point 6?
So the last point is that, and this is again something that is offered from a Christian worldview. And the point really is that if naturalism isn't true, then our culture, which is built on those foundations, is going to be increasingly asking us to live in unreality.
Okay.
To live in ways that contradict the way things actually are, the true truth, the real reality. And that's what what we should expect to see if naturalism isn't true is that we're over time increasingly having to live against the grain, and we'll feel the toll on that in ourselves, which is really what I want to talk about. So a few quick examples would be that if we are going to maintain our cultural stories and they're not built on the truth, then we'll find we have to keep shutting down everything that contradicts them.
Right.
We'll become increasingly averse to self-critical reflection and critical discussion. We will back away from reason and rationality where that takes us in a different direction. And it's worth noting that some of the stories of our culture are kind of actively promoting this.
Yeah, so I think we see some of that, like people being unwilling to like you say, have discussions about certain things because people don't like if there's disagreements or... like you mentioned in one of the previous videos about that person that wasn't allowed to go to the debate, that unable to do that sort of thing.
I think that's a really important dimension of what's happening, and within critical theory and some of the critical theories, even the use of reason and logic and rational argument is being boxed as something that's to do with white men and kind of heteronormative. And say even within the theory, there's a kind of shutting down of those sort of things that are going on. But if it isn't true, and that's what's happening, we're being forced to live against the grain. And we know that when we do that as humans, it has devastating impacts on us. So if we overwork, we know that eventually we break down. Our bodies, our humans, we were only designed to be able to do a certain amount. And if we do too much, we stop functioning well. We have to eat a certain amount to be healthy. We know that if we don't do that, we no longer function as we should. And so in all sorts of practical ways, we can tell when we're not living the way we were designed to live from a Christian worldview, or the way that we're meant to live. And I suggest that we actually see this going on in our culture, that the more we're encouraged to live in these ways, we don't cope very well. There's a huge emotional and mental toll that comes with shutting down the things that seem to contradict our cultural worldview, like say things we might be uncomfortable with, where we might disagree. There's a huge emotional toll that comes with keep trying to make truth generate a beliefs where this truth making, remember that contrast, truth making, truth finding? Truth making takes a massive toll on us. We have to become the centre of the universe, the centre of all knowledge, the centre of all morality.
And there comes with that, I think, a massive pressure, like you say, you know, a pressure to, I've got to be everything I think makes me a good person, or, you know.
And you've got to decide what good is. And you've got to justify that to everyone else. And then you've got to ensure that your view wins.
And not get exhausted in the process.
But you will get exhausted in the process. And you will despair in the process. And you will... And then if you're told that actually you can't even use your reason and your logic, and you can't open yourself up to Chris, what are you meant to do? And so there are many causes of the mental health crisis that we're seeing today, and the massive lack of resilience in younger people, and all these things that social commentators talk about. But I think that our cultural worldview is part of the reason for that, because of what it's requiring of people. They weren't made to deliver. And again, there's a sort of sadness in observing that, really, because you're sold a dream and delivered something that crushes your humanity ultimately, and it's all going wrong. And there's no solutions within these worldviews for these things that we're in.
But presumably, not everyone is going to agree with that.
No, I think obviously many people that will hold this worldview consciously might disagree with my assessment. That's fine. I think disagreement's possible. The point of what we're trying to do Unravelling is open up these things, because it's also true, I think, that many people, they don't really think about their worldview. That's where we started in video 1, wasn't it?
Not aware of glasses.
We don't take the glasses off to have a look at them.
Yeah.
And so most people haven't said, what are the logical consequences of my beliefs?
Yeah.
Where does this take me in the end?
Mm-hmm.
And so they might experience some of the negative effects, but never associate that with their worldview. They might just think life's hard.
Yeah.
So what we want to do in Unravelling, what we've tried to do tonight is say, some of the things we're experiencing, these are the reasons.
This is why.
Like, this is a logical consequence of these worldviews. This is where it takes you.
Yeah.
And hopefully in doing that, we'll all be better able to do some of that.
Yeah.
Oh, this is what I believe. Maybe is that where it takes me logically? But you can disagree, but at least we're starting to ask the question now and get into it.
Yeah, and I think it does make sense in that, like you say, we're all experiencing bits of this or parts of it in different areas of our lives, and I think it's sort of, like you say, as we don't have these well thought through ideas of what our worldviews are, and the more unthought through we are, almost we feel this even more.
Yeah, I mean, none of us has a take out the box, ready to go, perfect naturalist worldview or perfect Christian worldview.
Yeah.
Most Christians part of their worldview is Christian and
Yeah.
converted, and other parts of their worldview aren't.
Yeah.
Most atheists, most modern, postmodern people in our culture, this will be some of their worldview, but
Yeah.
they'll have other things. So
does that mean then we all sort of have a little bit of a mixed bag?
yeah, and this is totally internally contradictory.
Okay.
The more we evaluate it, the more problems that will give us. But in reality, most people have patched a worldview together. That's what we're pleading on, is an unravelling, is saying, let's think about that, because that actually isn't coherent
Okay.
to say, I'm going to have a bit of this and a bit of that and a bit of the other.
Yeah.
And the more fully we have developed a worldview that has integrity, that like holds together, the more we will experience its consequences.
Okay.
So the sort of more fully aware and intentionally we're brought into our cultural worldview, I would argue the more we'll experience these things.
Right.
The more fully aware and intentionally we're brought into a Christian worldview, the more fully we'll experience the entailments of a Christian worldview.
I guess that's like the fruit of what you're living in, isn't it?
Yeah.
So what about a Christian worldview then? What does that entail?
Yeah.
And what are some of the consequences of living in a Christian worldview?
Again, so much to say.
Yep.
Whole of 2,000 years of Christian reflection on that. But we've got 4 points that we're going to look at.
Can you condense it for us?
We're going to look at 4 points that are particularly pertinent for some of the things that we want to talk about in Unravelling. So the first one, to jump straight in, is the first basic entailment of the Christian worldview is that if we are created, there's not just nature, God's the creator of all that exists, including us. If we're created, then there's a reality to which we are accountable.
Okay.
We can't just make reality how we want. It's there. It's been created by
living
God.
in it.
We have to learn to live in it.
Okay.
And to find our place in it. And that has massive consequences for how we see the world, really, the fact that we have to live in God's creation. So one of those is that this is also a moral reality.
Right.
We don't just live in a physical reality, but we live in a moral reality. God has determined what's right and wrong, good and bad, what leads to human flourishing, what doesn't. And we have to come under that. We have to submit to the truth that God knows, rather than create our own version of a moral world. He's the moral lawgiver, if you like, and we're the recipients of that. So again, our task is not poiesis.
No.
It's not making this stuff. It's mimesis. It's coming into line with.
Yeah, we're looking to God to understand our reality.
That's right. He determines it. And I'm using quite deliberate vocabulary about submission and in determining, and because it's really clear then that one of the entailments of a Christian worldview is that our task is to submit into the order of reality that God creates, not to be free to make whatever kind of reality we might consider that we want. And
that's very different, isn't it? That submission rather than that making the reality.
Yeah, it requires a humbling of our own will. Our task really then is submission into the true truth, into the real reality, which are all ways of talking about the will of God.
Okay.
He willed the reality that is, and our task is to submit into that, which is a very different kind of story than the one that we hear told in our culture.
Yeah, it's very different. And does that mean then that at times that we're going to feel like we're sort of losing some of our freedom?
Yeah.
Or that because we have God that is above everything and holds reality, that we're sort of under him and therefore we can feel oppressed by him at times? Or
is exactly the language that's going to press all our buttons. If we've lived in the story of identity and the story of power and oppression, isn't it? We're under him. It's oppressive. Where's my freedom? Where's my... And so in part one of Unravelling, we did produce a couple of videos on freedom, and there's more videos in part two of Unravelling as well that will tease this out a little bit more. But the basic point is that in the Christian worldview, freedom is actually found in and through submission to reality.
Okay.
And to try and live against reality, which is what the story of I can do anything that I want, even if it's totally against the reality that's actually there. That doesn't lead us to freedom at all, but it enslaves us.
So you're saying then that in the submitting to God, that there actually comes like more rest or more, as opposed to the exhaustion we were talking about before.
So when freedom is to be able to live the life that you were created to live, not to just do anything that you want, that's negative freedom that's actually unsustainable on its own. Real freedom is to live how you were made to live, and that can only be found by living in line with what's actually real, which is why freedom comes through submission, which is a paradox, and we're going to come back to paradoxes a little bit later on.
So have you got some more points for us, Jim?
Yeah, so moving on to point 2. So point 2 then, part of another entailment of a Christian worldview is to take all that we talked about last time, the ways that we come to know the truth as Christians, and our task is to continually pursue all 4 of these. If our task isn't truth making, our task is truth finding, it is a task. And part of a Christian worldview is to pursue this in all our 4 ways of knowing.
Those were like the Bible and I'm trying to remember them now. I'm like,
I'll give you them.
Go on then, you tell me.
I'm tempted to test you, but no, we'll just say, and I want to give you an example with each one actually to try and make it a little bit more grounded. So we talked about experience of nature, our reason, the general revelation that we come to know things through our observation of nature, our experience and our reasoning. And one of the ways that we pursue this as a Christian then is in something called the natural law tradition, which is where if God has created us and created the world we live in, then there are some ways that we can look at ourselves, look at this world, and ask, how are we created to live? And how does that give us a guide to what's true and good and beautiful?
So we're almost looking at our design. How have we been designed?
How have we been designed? How is it that we're meant to work? And that's part of how we work out the truth of the true, the good and the beautiful. So that's kind of one way of knowing. We also talked about reason. We as Christians believe that using our reason is really important. So we typically ask, whenever a truth claim is presented, we'll want to ask things like, is it internally consistent? So for example, to say there is no absolute truth is internally inconsistent because it's an absolute truth claim. So we'd say, is this belief internally consistent? We would ask, does it correspond to what we observe of reality? Sort of linking to the natural law stuff. And we'd also ask, is this livable? The kind of practical livable test, which is part of what we're doing in Unravelling. The true truth should be livable. Reason, adequately and correctly used, should produce a worldview that's livable. And if it's not livable, then our reason should start asking some questions about that. When it comes to the Bible, we need to pursue how to read the Bible responsibly. There's all kinds of irresponsible ways to read the Bible. Most of those illustrated at different times in the Christian history. So we need to learn what's a responsible way to read the Bible, and how do we do that. We should all be pursuing that.
So we can always learn and grow more and get better at that.
It's part of our task in truth finding, is to learn how to do that well. And finally, tradition, which might be the one that's less familiar to us of these, that actually engaging with our Christian history, with what Christians have written and said in the past, is important. So G.K. Chesterton, I love the way he put this. He said, paying attention to tradition is a democratic approach to Christian thinking, where you give a vote to those who were in the past. Which is just a really helpful way of thinking about it. It's not that we're controlled by tradition, but we're attentive to it. If we believe that God has revealed truth to Christians before us, we give a vote to the past.
And I guess that also means that we don't have to throw out what was said in the past because we've got new thought.
No.
We can still refer back to it and learn from it. And
a critical and generous engagement. So we want to learn from them, but of course we're critical. We may disagree. No human has a perfect corner on the truth, including those in the tradition in the past. But a healthy approach to it, I think, is really important. So that's one of the consequences of the Christian worldview, that we should be pursuing all 4 ways of knowing. This is how we come to be truth finders.
Great.
So moving on. The third entailment of a Christian worldview is that our hope fundamentally lies beyond nature. We talked about this a little bit on the last section, didn't we? So I won't major on it now. But it's important that our hope as Christians, because it lies in God who's transcendent, because he holds the future, because we believe that one day he will put all things right, that's the biblical story, that shapes our hope.
Yeah, it's a great hope, isn't it?
It's a great hope, but it's also important to understand how it affects the way we live.
Okay.
Because if we didn't have that secure hope in the future, then we have every reason to despair and to give up.
Yeah.
Or we have reason to, like we talked about before, get involved, perhaps a violent way. It's all absolutely on us. But this shape of Christian hope means that we can actually work now without losing heart when things go wrong.
Yeah.
Without losing heart when we make mistakes, without losing heart when we seem to make no progress. We almost expect this at times.
Yeah.
Like while sin is present in the world, before God comes and restores all things, there's no full hope in any human system or activity.
I think it means as well that we can accept our human limitation as well, because God is there, he's bigger, he knows everything, and so I can be more comfortable with that I'm human, I'm not going to get it right all the time.
And you might be tempted to think that leads to disengagement, but actually what this leads is to a more wholehearted engagement in issues that matter now.
Yeah.
Because we can give ourselves into these things without burning out, dropping out through discouragement, because we know that ultimately our hope is secure.
Yes.
And say that spread of hope, that part of it lies now, as we work for the kingdom of God now, and we want to see his goodness and beauty come now, but knowing that will fully come in the future gives a unique shape to the Christian life.
Okay.
That is quite a high contrast with the shape of hope in a naturalistic worldview.
Yeah.
So that's important, and it will become important when we start to talk about issues in parts 3 and 4 of Unravelling.
Yeah.
Of how we live in the goodness of God now, but also that a lot of it's not yet,
like for the
and is
future.
coming. So that's important. So fourth and finally for tonight on a Christian worldview, we have to learn to live in paradox.
Okay.
So paradox is two things that are both true, that stand in some tension with one another. And many philosophers would argue that all truth is ultimately shaped a bit like this. But there's particular Christian paradoxes. We've talked about one already, that you find freedom through surrender.
Okay.
It's something that's true, but we have to learn to live in that. Yeah, so other paradoxes, there's so many paradoxes that are important in Christianity, but other ones that we're going to just mention tonight. So we want to find our own identity and our personal significance. And in the Christian worldview, we find our true individual identity through union and community.
Okay.
Through union with God, being embraced into his community. And again, that can sound like a paradox. Well, but how do I lose my identity when? But actually, no, we find our truest identity the more we're united with God. So there's another paradox for you. Hope. We talked about that one just now, didn't we? As Christians, we learn to have more hope the more able we are to accept the deferment of the things we hope for.
Okay.
So when we learn to accept the reality of sin and the brokenness of the world, and that until God restores all things, nothing will be perfect. The better we accept that, the more hope we live.
The more we put down the burden, the more hope we have.
And the more engaged we become.
Yeah.
So this is another paradox. Confidence and humility. We talked about that last time, didn't we? That the more confident we become, that there is a true truth and that we can know it, the more humble we should become in our limitations. And the less my winning or my beliefs become important, knowing that true truth actually exists. There's another paradox for us, and we're going to come across more of these. So rather than continue down the list, I think I'd like to leave it there. But it shouldn't surprise us if we want to live in a Christian worldview that again and again we will come across these paradoxes in which truth resides. Again, maybe I'll finish with another quote from G.K. Chesterton, who said that the only thing to be said in defense of paradoxes is that they're usually true. And so I agree. So those are some of the entailments of a Christian worldview. This is some of what it's like to live in it, some of the felt experience of what it entails and what it logically takes us to.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tim. That's been so good. And we've called this video Searching for Meaning. And I guess having gone through those worldviews, we can see that they really are just searching for meaning in their own ways.
Yeah, I think that's what we're all trying to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's crucial because as we're searching for good and meaningful things, or what is right, these are really coming at it from different, they're searching for it in different ways, aren't they?
Yeah, radically different ways.
Yeah.
Really, we talk that truth making, truth finding.
Yeah.
Very different ways of trying to search for meaning. Hopefully, we've been able to explore that a bit tonight, though.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in the next part of Unravelling, as we go into part 3, we're going to be starting to look at more specific issues.
That's right, yeah.
So we're going to be looking at gender and sex, sexuality, marriage. And it's really important that we understand all of this, so that we can move forward. Do you think that we're ready to start to approach some of these big topics?
Yeah, there's always more to be said, isn't there? And it's hard to feel ever fully ready. But hopefully we have got some foundations in place. Hopefully we've been able to see a bit more clearly the glasses we wear. Yeah. And particularly the way that culture is shaping us. And that'll all be really important when it comes to those issues that you mentioned, to understand why we are where we are in culture. Yeah. But also to think then about how we search for truth and for meaning in that cultural context. Okay.
And so as we approach, as we go on to approach these other issues, how much are we going to be looking at, is it possible to mix and match the worldviews that we have?
Yeah.
Is that okay to do? Is that something that we do?
Yeah. Can I be a Christian and hold to the identity story, or can I have a naturalist foundation, but I quite like this bit of the Christian worldview and that sounds good? And that's a really important question, because the truth is that we all patch together a worldview. We've mentioned that earlier, didn't we? And so it does happen all the time. Yeah. But it's not tenable. Okay. You can't start from a naturalistic foundations and then work with Christian sort of assumptions, because Christian assumptions come from theistic foundations, not naturalistic foundations. And similarly, you can't start from the base of a Christian worldview and then go on to just buy into some of the cultural stories without realizing that they're operating from very different places. So why we've done these 2 parts is to try and help us not do that. Okay. Or to put it maybe more honestly, to try and help us to see where we are doing that.
Yeah, I think I recognise that. But actually, I can see that I look at some of them and go, oh yeah, I really agree with that. Oh, I can see that in some of my thinking, actually.
Yeah. And none of us will be perfect models of a coherent worldview, but if we can move towards a worldview that's more coherent, then that would be a good thing. And hopefully we have set ourselves in a position to start to do that. And the test will be on some of the issues, won't it? It's when an issue comes along that we're forced, if we're willing to ask, where is that belief coming from worldview-wise?
Yeah, which worldview am I which fence am I sitting on at the moment?
Yeah. And is that built on foundations I agree with? Yeah. Or do I actually hold an opinion that's built on foundations that I deeply disagree with? Yeah. Then that's going to give us a problem, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So how are we going to be tackling that in part 3 and 4?
So broad brushstrokes within each part. So part 3 will be gender, and then part 4, sex, sexuality and marriage. And with each one, we want to have one evening where we really explore where's our culture at on this issue at the moment. Because it's not that our culture is all in the same place. Yeah. So what's the conversation going on in our culture around this issue? And then we want to do a second evening where we say, what has a Christian worldview got to say into that? Okay. What's a Christian worldview got to say about gender, sex, sexuality, etc.? And then we'll have 2 other videos in each part as well, where we'll try and get to some of the detailed questions with gender. How do we engage the transgender movement, or how do we engage with transgender people? Some of these,
so really some more specific,
which I think a lot of people watching are wanting us to get to. Yeah, and we are going to try and get there, but we do think it's important to continue to do the worldview work with those issues. So that's the sort of way it'll play out. The details, obviously, will come in time.
Watch this space.
But broad brushstrokes, that's how we're hoping to tackle those issues.
Fantastic. Thanks for watching. We really hope that you found this really helpful. And I want to just encourage you, before we move on to part 3 of Unravelling, that if you need to go back and re-watch any of our videos, that could be really helpful to get our heads more fully around everything we've been tackling. Because in part 3, we are going to be exploring gender. So for more details, please check out our website. Please visit www.amblecocc.org.uk/unravelling. We'll see you next time.